Welcome to Module 4. In the last module, besides tripping over words, we talked about emotionally destabilizing communication patterns. That would include gaslighting, blame shifting, invalidation, emotional withdrawal, and the hidden dynamics that slowly create confusion inside emotionally unhealthy relationships. Now, in this module, we're going to talk about something many survivors feel deeply ashamed about. Why leaving can feel so difficult. Because one of the most painful experiences people go through is recognizing that a relationship is emotionally unhealthy. And then still feeling emotionally attached to it. Many survivors judge themselves harshly for that very attachment. They think, if I still miss them, maybe the relationship was real. If I still love them, maybe I am the problem. If I can't let go, maybe I'm weak. But trauma bonds are not created through weakness. They are created through repeated cycles of emotional instability and emotional relief. That's important. Now, first, let's define what a trauma bond actually is. A trauma bond is a powerful emotional attachment formed through repeated cycles of pain, confusion, distance, relief, affection, and emotional inconsistency. And over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned to chase emotional relief after emotional distress. That cycle can become extremely powerful in your mind, especially when moments of emotional closeness are unpredictable. Now, remember what we talked about in the previous module, intermittent reinforcement, one moment coldness, the next moment affection, one moment distance, then the next moment becomes emotional closeness. One moment, it's like crazy, the confusion. The next moment, reassurance. I mean, when you look at it, that unpredictability creates emotional dependency because the nervous system starts craving emotional relief, not peace, relief. That matters enormously because peace feels stable. Relief feels intense. Peace creates grounding. Relief creates emotional craving. And many survivors confuse emotional intensity with emotional connection, especially when emotionally healthy stability feels unfamiliar. Now, here is another important truth. Many trauma bonds are reinforced through emotional contrast. The emotional highs feel powerful because the emotional lows feel painful. The affection feels intense because the withdrawal felt frightening. The closeness feels overwhelming because the distance felt emotionally destabilizing. That emotional contrast creates attachment. And many survivors slowly become emotionally addicted to the return of emotional relief. Not because the relationship feels safe, but because the nervous system becomes conditioned to chase moments of emotional regulation after periods of emotional instability. That's why people often describe these relationships as addictive, obsessive, impossible to walk away from. But let me tell you something important here. This attachment does not mean the relationship was emotionally healthy. And it does not mean your emotional pain was imaginary. In fact, trauma bonds often become strongest in relationships where emotional instability is repeated. It's repeated consistently over time. Now, another painful part of the trauma bonding is this: many survivors are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the hope, to the fantasy, to the emotional highs, the version of the relationship that they wanted it to become. That's so very important, because sometimes people are grieving emotional potential more than emotional reality. And that grief can feel incredibly, incredibly painful, especially when the beginning of the relationship felt emotionally intense. This is where idealization becomes important. Many emotionally unhealthy relationships begin with attention, they begin with validation, they begin with intensity, they begin with chemistry, deep emotional connection, fast attachment. And in the beginning, the relationship may feel almost magical emotionally. You feel seen, you feel chosen, you feel understood, you feel connected. And when that emotional closeness later becomes inconsistent, many survivors spend enormous amounts of energy trying to recover the emotional experience from the beginning, trying to get back to the good version, trying to restore the emotional closeness they once felt. But over time, the relationship becomes more focused on emotional recovery than emotional peace. That matters, because healthy relationships are not built around constantly recovering from emotional instability. Healthy relationships create emotional grounding. Now, let's talk about another major part of trauma bonding: identity erosion. Let me say it again: identity erosion. Many survivors lose connection with themselves inside emotionally unhealthy relationships. Their focus shifts almost entirely towards managing the relationship, monitoring emotional shifts, avoiding conflict, maintaining closeness, preventing withdrawal, or trying to stabilize the other person emotionally. And over time, they stop asking, what do I need emotionally? Now everything becomes centered around, how do I keep this relationship emotionally stable? And that within itself creates exhaustion and often emotional dependency, because the relationship slowly becomes tied to identity, self-worth, hope, validation, and emotional survival. Now, here's something many survivors don't realize: trauma bonds often intensify after emotional separation. Because once the emotional cycle is interrupted, the nervous system starts craving relief from the instability it became conditioned to. That's why many people experience obsessive thinking, emotional withdrawal, uh, emotional withdrawal symptoms like anxiety, urges to reconnect, or emotional panic after separation. Again, that does not mean the relationship was healthy. It means the nervous system became conditioned to emotional inconsistency. That's why healing requires more than simply letting go. Healing often requires rebuilding emotional stability internally, rebuilding self-trust, rebuilding identity, relearning emotional safety. Now, another dangerous part of the trauma bond is this: many survivors begin romanticizing emotional survival. They romanticize it. They confuse struggle, intensity, pain, obsession, and instability with what? Depth of love. But emotional suffering is not proof of emotional compatibility. And emotional chaos is not proof of emotional intimacy. That distinction, very, very important. Now, let's talk briefly about why people often return to emotionally unhealthy relationships repeatedly. Usually it's not because logic disappeared. It's because emotional attachment and emotional conditioning are stronger than the intellectual awareness alone. A person may logically recognize this relationship hurts me, while emotionally still craving connection, reassurance, validation, or emotional relief. That internal conflict creates tremendous emotional confusion, and many survivors judge themselves harshly for that very contradiction. But healing begins when people stop shaming themselves for emotional attachment and start understanding the psychological pattern beneath it. That's one of the reasons this decoder system exists, not to create shame, but to create reality. Now, let me say something very, very carefully here. This module is not about encouraging hopelessness or emotional coldness. The goal is not never trust anyone again. The goal is emotional awareness, recognition, and you know what? Most importantly, clarity. Because once people begin recognizing emotional instability, and when they start recognizing it honestly, they can begin separating emotional addiction from emotional safety. And that distinction changes everything. Now, before we close this module, I want you to reflect on something honestly. Are you emotionally attached to peace, or are you emotionally attached to relief? Are you attached to emotional safety, or are you attached to emotional intensity? Are you attached to consistency or emotional unpredictability? Those questions really do matter because many survivors spend years chasing emotional highs while their nervous system quietly begs for emotional stability. And healing often begins when people stop chasing emotional chaos and start reconnecting with emotional safety instead. And in the next module, we are going to explore what emotionally healthy relationships actually feel like. Not fantasy, not perfection, but emotional safety, consistency, accountability, grounding, and the difference between emotional intensity and emotional peace. Let's continue decoding these patterns together.